State law versus federal law. State law versus federal law. So when I was before I got to law school, I didn't really have an understanding of how the different jurisdictions work, like state versus federal, right? I know I took classes and I was tested about it, but I really didn't understand it, right? But to kind of keep it simple, there's state courts and there's federal courts. State courts deal with cases that fall under state law. Federal courts deal with cases that deal with federal law. Okay, that's simple. But what do those cases look like, right? What makes something a state case and what makes something a federal case? Well, there's different things that trigger that. I do criminal defense, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the criminal stuff, and then I'll talk about some civil things, okay? Let's say somebody commits a murder, right? They commit a murder, they committed it in an apartment in Houston, Texas, okay? That's going to be state law. That's going to be state law. Let's say somebody robs a bank. That could be state law or federal law, right? And both the states or the feds could try to prosecute the individual. Sometimes one jurisdiction says we'll just take the case. Sometimes both jurisdictions take the case. After the trial on one case, the other jurisdiction steps in and have a trial. Now, some people might say, I thought somebody couldn't get tried for the same thing, or if they get not guilty, they can get tried again. That's within the jurisdiction you're in. So you're talking about double jeopardy, right? So double jeopardy works like this. If I get charged for murder in Texas and I beat the case, I'm found not guilty, the state of Texas can't charge me for murder again. But the feds potentially could charge me for murder, right? Again, let's say I go into a federal building in the state of Texas and shoot somebody. Well, that triggers state because it happened in Texas and federal because it happened in a federal building, which gives them federal jurisdiction. So both of those jurisdictions can go after me or try to prosecute me for murder. Let's say I beat the state case. The feds can still come in because that's two different jurisdictions, state versus feds. If it was only state, they couldn't try to prosecute me again. But because it's state jurisdiction and federal, the feds can now jump in and try to prosecute me. The reason you see a lot of drug trafficking crimes in federal court is because one of the things that triggers what we call federal jurisdiction is things happening across different states. Like a drug conspiracy that starts in Texas and ends up in Illinois, right? Somebody buys the drugs in Texas and they drive it through all these states and they take it, crossing all these states and they get to Illinois. Well, you cross multiple states, right? So that would trigger federal jurisdiction a lot of times. You'll see things that occur in federal buildings, like an FBI building or a federal bank building or something like that. A federal agency building. Somebody did something on federal property like a national park. Things like that. That might trigger federal jurisdiction. When it comes to like civil cases, lawsuits, you'll see you'll see cases like civil rights crimes, right? Because that's a federal act, Civil Rights Act, right? And if somebody violating a federal act, like the Civil Rights Act, you'll say, okay, well, this company violated my civil rights, so I'm going to sue them in federal court. There's an argument at times where you can sue somebody in state court, but a lot of times the avenue for that is federal court because there's federal laws in place that protect people. There's some federal laws to protect people where states haven't passed those same laws, right? In the city of Houston, depending on the type of discrimination somebody deals with, you might not have a complaint at the city level. You might only, depending on how it was taken care of, have an opportunity to go to the feds in federal court to take care of that. State and fed, two different places. That's why you have state courts and that's why you have federal courts. Each of the courts have levels, like where you have the trial level, the Court of Appeals, and then the High Court. Each state has that as well, their High Court. And in the federal level, the High Court is the Supreme Court. But right below the High Court is the Court of Appeals, which we call circuit courts. And then below that is the district courts, the trial courts for feds. So you'll have federal courts, you'll have state courts. So if you're wondering, like, what's the difference, basically, you're dealing with federal law. Things that trigger federal law, the state courts are things that deal with state law, including, from traffic tickets all the way to murder cases. So that's kind of the difference.